My name is Sydney, and this is my video out. My name is Sydney, and my pronouns are he, him, and his. I identify as transgender. I'm a transgender guy, or a man of trans experience. I've heard that one too. This is a tough one. First knew that I was trans. Let's see. I always feel like these things sneak up on me, to be honest, because I first identified as a lesbian, and so I feel like there was a moment of first coming out as a lesbian. That's part of my trans history, and with that, I mean, I think I took a step back and was like, well, play rugby, I'm hanging out with a certain group of people. At the time, the L word was on TV, and I was like, wow, I really identify with this. So I think that was kind of like a first step. And I definitely felt in my element as a lesbian then, and I think I reached a point where I was kind of more androgynous, and this is before people were using the term non-binary, and I definitely identified as like a queer lesbian woman at the time, and I feel like I was kind of like dragged out of a trans closet by a good friend of mine, my friend Charlie, who's a trans guy, and I remember he saw me, and it was one of those moments where there's a recognition and almost like an understanding of experience, and I remember I was like staying at his place, and I think like I was like struggling with my binder at the time, and he was like, what are you doing? You know, I see you. And I was like, what are you talking about? And then we had a long conversation about transitioning and his experience, and I think it was one of those moments where I realized, like, yeah, there's a lot about my life or just how I'm living that I could tell like I wasn't quite happy. Like I kept on thinking that I was like doing everything great, and I was being so exploratory in my sexual orientation or gender identity, and then, you know, to have somebody be like, yeah, I can see you struggling was kind of embarrassing, but also a nice like reality check, or it was like a moment of pause for me to just reflect and be like, yeah, you know, there is validation for these feelings that I feel about myself or about my body, and it's not wrong and it's not shameful, and there's actually something I can do about it, and I think that was maybe that moment for me of like, okay, I'm trans, and that's okay. Ooh, yes, I would say, yeah, Charlie, he's, at the time, we were in the same house. I lived in Europe at the time, and he lived in Amsterdam, and I remember I was visiting him for a ball, and I think it was like that moment where we just had this like very long, like almost like romantic conversation walking through the streets of Amsterdam and sort of talking about what it means to be trans, and I think it was then that I finally realized, like, yeah, okay, this is how I see myself. Let's see, tell the rest of the world. Oof, because I feel like today that means, when did you post it on Facebook? Right, and I think, I mean, that's probably sometime around then. I think I decided I wanted to use different pronouns, and I feel like it was a slow easing out. Like, I think I had told a small circle of friends maybe, and then that started to go larger, and I think I had changed my pronouns on like Facebook or something, and yeah, and I think I just started introducing myself in that way. I don't know if I had an actual like, I am trans. Maybe on one of these like national coming out days, I think I might have like had written that or something of like, you know, this is how I see myself, etc. But yeah, I mean, as far as like a larger coming out, I would say it was probably then. I've seen both sides of this. I know, especially for, like, I had a friend who wrote a piece about For a lot of communities of color, I know that people have different ways of kind of coming out. So like, for example, instead of doing this whole like, mom, dad, I have something to tell you, for some people, like just bringing your partner to the family cookout is like acknowledgement enough. And I think I am more open to like different possibilities and just accepting the fact that everybody has a different way of operating in the world. So I think if it works for you, of like having a very formal, you know, and in some ways I actually think it's nice that we have a script, because I think especially for LGBT people, because we don't get a lot of scripts, like I feel like straight people get the scripts of life of like, you go on a date in high school and then it's like, you know, XYZ and you know, whatever, and you get married and this is how you propose. So it's nice that we at least have a script for a very big part of our lives, which is like being super vulnerable to the entire world and to our families. So you can kind of choose to do that script of like talking to your family or your friends and, you know, these are the things you could do. But I think it's also cool that you don't have to do that and you can kind of do things your own way, whatever way makes sense to you. I would say to take your time and to be caring and loving to yourself. I think it's really important to not be judgmental of yourself and also like lean into those feelings. I think a lot of the things that we're taught are to ignore our feelings, especially around being LGBTQ, that whatever you're feeling is just a passing phase, or, you know, etc. So I think for you to just stop and be like, you know, let me sit with this feeling, even if I don't know exactly what it is. I think also tapping into community is really key, because to me the hardest part is when you're isolated. I feel like it's even harder now. I feel like I was at the tail end of like a slightly analog LGBTQ era. Like I went to dyke bars, like I remember that, and when they existed, like actual establishments, not just party nights. So I feel like I was in community and had that support in certain ways, whereas today everything feels digital. And I think that's a valid community too, because for me, transitioning, it has been really amazing to connect with trans people on Twitter or Facebook groups, etc. But I think that's like a big portion, is reaching out to folks and tapping into those communities wherever you can, and just knowing that you're not alone and you're not alone in your thoughts. I think there's enormous power in our stories, and I think it's really important for people to know, again, like they're not alone if you are somebody who is LGBTQ and maybe struggling or wrestling with these questions. And I think it's also important for the outside world to also know that that we're here and we're human, and stories help humanize us. They they just give voice, I think, in a way that's just so powerful and just really important. Well, we should be sharing them, we should be uplifting them, we should be retweeting them, we should be reposting them. Also support people who are doing that kind of work, so supporting queer LGBTQ creatives, folks who are really doing that sort of activism like yourself. But I just think the more folks know, the better it is for everybody in the end. The most pressing issue. I think for sure the fact that trans women of color particularly are being murdered, that our trans community is super vulnerable in this time. I think that it's a very complex issue, and it has everything to do with the discussion we're having around job discrimination, this like Supreme Court decision, which is so important, which will affect all of us. To me, these are very, very big issues, because we're talking about our livelihoods, we're talking about our right to living with dignity, our right to being authentic as ourselves and not having to go back in hiding or be marginalized, and our right to self-determination, which is like the ultimate form of empowerment. So to me, like, yeah, those issues are super, super important and definitely need to be like front and center about sort of where our community movement is right now. Most hope? Oh my. Some days are grim. Like, you just don't want to open any sort of social media. You're like, oh, Jesus. What gives me hope? I think, well, I think activists doing this work, I think people raising their voices, I think there can be ways where we see certain things moving, but I also think in any movement there's also stuff you don't see that's happening, this kind of like activist work that sort of comes out later. So, I do feel hopeful in that people are speaking up and naming some of these problems, because I think the fact that, even in the mainstream, that we are talking about trans women who have been murdered, to me that's a certain kind of progress where it's like, okay, at least we're talking about it, but I also hope that that's mobilized to action. So I think, yeah, this whole web and network of nonprofits and lay people and people on the street and activists and just everybody kind of like continuing to mobilize, and I'm hopeful in that sense that we can be activated and that at least it's like in our consciousness. So to me the next step is just really moving on that action. Let's see. I feel like if I'm hopeful, I think it'll be easier to be trans. I would hope that it's easier to get access to medical care, that trans people don't have to fight with insurance companies or with their employers, that our jobs are protected, that there is a greater conversation around climate change and that's being treated seriously. I also hope by then there's more LGBTQ people in jobs, like well-paying jobs, and particularly LGBTQ people of color, that we have a seat at the table as well. I also hope that we never have to talk about murders ever again in our community, that is a relic of the past. So yeah, I mean, that's the hopeful side of me. The other side of me is like, well, there might be some, who knows, residuals here or there, but I don't know, it's like, I want to be more on the hopeful side. My favorite part about being me? My goodness. Favorite part? I mean, I mentioned I'm in the ballroom scene, so I love that I get to Vogue. I love that I get to go to balls and dress up and have fun with my friends, and that I get to be a part of that community and hear those stories and share those stories as well. I love that I get to cook the things I cook, I guess. I mean, I make a very good chicken soup and a very nice apple pie from scratch. So that is also a nice part about being me. Oh, I also think that I get to laugh a lot. That's, to me, is like a very important part, and probably one of my favorite parts of just living. So I think, yeah, that would be another thing. Okay, well, okay, this is maybe a little bit of a PSA around trans stuff, because I think one thing that I've learned transitioning, it's very hard. And I know that sounds like kind of obvious, but it's harder than you think, and it's it's exhausting as well. And like the exhausting part is like stuff that people don't see, because I think when it comes to transgender issues, one thing our society loves is transformation. I think this is why drag is very popular. People love to see going from A to B, right? So they're like, okay, so your transition ended. And of course, I always say it's the ultimate rainbow. There's no real end. Like, when do you finish transitioning? But beyond that, it's also, when I say it's exhausting, I mean, there's so many parts, because on the one hand, it's incredibly bureaucratic. And this is something I don't think people really talk about, is there's just lots of paperwork. There's paperwork around like medically transitioning if you're trying to get access to hormones. There's paperwork around surgery and like a series of checks that you have to go through to do this. There's like dealing with insurance companies, dealing with hospitals, dealing with all this kind of stuff. So you might see a trans person and think, well, you know, they made this choice and that, you know, it's just flip a switch and, well, now you're trans. And it's like, no, it's like an enormous process. And that's just the bureaucratic side, because then there's also all the emotional labor, which is your parents, your family, your friend circle. I mean, I've had so much grieving just around the loss of friendships because I have decided to live authentically. And it's so hard because you have to deal with, wow, this person who I really cared about or who I thought really cared about me, you know, can't come along with me on this journey. And I have to just accept that, like, this is who they are and where they're at, and that's what that is. So I think it's just like a lot that I feel like I've had to carry over time. And even with that, like job loss, I mean, I had to deal with that too. I was in a PhD program and just dealing with so much transphobia, and I had to make a choice of like, do I live my life and excel in that, or do I have to like kill a part of myself every day showing up to this place that is not at all for me? So it's like, that's another, you know, another difficult part of navigating. And I think, you know, people put all the letters together, and obviously we know that there's enormous differences between all of them. And I feel like with trans stuff, it's so much deeper and like way harder than people realize. And it's way more than just an aesthetic or this kind of facade. Because I think that's the only part that people often see. They don't see all the difficulty behind it. They don't see all the struggles. So, you know, just for folks who are allies, just to be more mindful of that and understanding that, you know, we're dealing with a lot more than people think. So, yeah. But also for trans folks to know that it's, you know, I don't want to say necessarily that it gets better, but I think it's more manageable. If there's like a message to that, it's like, you know, and I think that there's solidarity in numbers. So, you know, when I am dealing with things, it's incredibly helpful to have community who is understanding and who is accepting and who can be there for me too. So